So welcome everyone to Drisha's Fall Programming and the first part of a 6-part series by Dr. Shana Strauch Schick on the laws of Kashrut and Jewish-Gentile relations. Dr. Shana Strauch Schick is a fellow of the Center for Israel Studies at Yeshiva University and teaches Talmud and halakhah at Michelet Mevaser Yerushalayim and Matan in Israel and in the Drisha Summer Kollel. In 2011, she became the first woman to be awarded a PhD in Talmudic literature from the Bernard Revel Graduate School at Yeshiva University, where she also completed an MA in Bible. She studied in the graduate program in Advanced Talmud at Stern College and has held postdoctoral fellowships at Bar Ilan and Haifa University. Her upcoming book, Between Thought and Deed, Intention in Talmudic Jurisprudence, examines the role of intentionality in the development of Talmudic law and is being published by Brill. Without further ado, Dr. Strauch Schick.
Thank you so much, Leah, and welcome everyone to our 6-part course on the laws of Kashrut. The laws that we're going to be focusing on are, as the title of this course suggests, those which have to do with the Jewish-Gentile relations, meaning it's not about food that is not kosher per se. For example, eating meat and milk together or pork or anything like that. It's more food that was prohibited because it was a way to either make some sort of a barrier between Jews and Gentiles to prevent intermarriage, as we're going to see, or maybe less the food become not kosher because it was prepared by a non-Jew. So we're going to see all these different factors at play, and how the fact that Jews live in a world with non-Jews and often did not own their own ovens to bake bread, or as we see in the US, live in a country where the dairy industry is very regulated, and therefore there's no concern that we're getting the milk from a pig where it's supposed to be a cow's milk. How the cultures we've lived in have affected these halakhot, these laws as well. So our starting point for these set of halakhot is a Mishnah in tractate Avodah Zarah, a tractate about idol worship and all the different laws about idolatry, different takanot in enactments that were made to help dissuade idolatry and the Jewish-Gentile relationships. And that's why these set of laws pertaining to Kashrut are in this tractate. Now, just a little introduction to the course. This is, while we are going to talk about historical context and social context, it is going to be primarily a text-based class where we learn halakhah be'iyun. We're going to learn the texts, and we're going to, read them in aside, some complicated Talmudic text, along with the medieval Rishonim, the medieval rabbis who explain the Talmudic text. And so, we're not going to zoom past through everything. We're going to have to really learn it and understand the text, some of them which can be very complicated. And this is not going to be, therefore, a survey of all the laws pertaining to Kashrut, but what we will get are some of the major principles. And in this case, we're going to see both, what is the reason for the laws and what are some of the leniencies which were applied in order to, work with the cultures that Jews were living in throughout a time where sometimes it was just impossible to follow some of these laws, and how we're able to work both with the halakhah and with the world that we have lived in throughout time. So that introduction, we're now going to get to it, and as the questions come up, we'll address them. If anyone's always welcome to either post a question on the chat, or well, I don't know how else you can actually post a question if you're live stream. Maybe email someone and they can ask on the chat. Okay, so we begin with the first Mishnah that I brought for you in the sources. I hope everyone has it. And this is a Mishnah which is in a tractate Avodah Zarah. I will share it on the screen. Done. Go, my PowerPoint here. It's written Abishal Akum. The first topic we're going to cover is food which has been cooked by a non-Jew. Okay, and the source for this all is the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, tractate Avodah Zarah, the second chapter 6 Mishnah therein. So you all have this source now. And the Mishnah lists 8 things which were made prohibited by the rabbis. And again, they are not prohibited in and of themselves. They're not actually a treif, they're not meat and milk, but they're things which the rabbis made prohibited. So this is what the Mishnah says. Ve'elu divarim she'ovdei kochavim asurim ve'ein isuran isur hana'ah. So the following articles, I gave you the English to this, the following articles of non-Jews are prohibited. But you can still derive a benefit from them. So, you can use it, for other things, you just can't eat them. So the first thing on the list is 1, chalav shel chavu oved kochavim, ve'ein Yisrael ro'aho. So milk which a non-Jew milked and a Jew didn't see it. So this is the source for the law known as halav Yisrael, milk that was produced by a Jew. Now, of course, we know in America, at least, there's a very famous heter that we rely on by Rav Moshe Feinstein, which we will get to in a few weeks, Bezrat Hashem. But milk of a non-Jew, which a Jew didn't see, you're not allowed to have. You're not allowed to eat. And why? Because presumably you don't know what animal it came from, if it's from a kosher animal or a non-kosher animal. That's number 1. Number 2, v'hapat v'hashemen shalahen. You cannot have the bread or the oil of a non-Jew either. Rebbe ubeitino hitiru hashemen. Now Rebbe, that's Rebbe Huda Hanasi, Rebbe Huda the prince, who's the editor of the Mishnah, he and his court allowed oil. Now we're going to get to a bread of a non-Jew, and as maybe many people know, we do eat the bread of a non-Jew. We do eat pat akum, which is why we're allowed to buy all the non-Jewish brands of bread. We're not limited to Grin Brown's chalot, for example. Okay, so that's number 2. 3, hashlakot ukivashim shadarkam latet letochan yayin vechometz. This is really 2 things. Hashlakot. Now, even though usually that means pickled food, this is understood. If you just look at Rashi, shlakot, go down to the next sources, kol davar shebishlu oved kochavim. Shlakot refers to any food which a non-Jew cooked. Ve'afilu b'kli tahor. And it's not about maybe, where we are worried that the non-Jew cooked the food in their pots, and their pots always have non-kosher food in them. Says Rashi, this is not because we are concerned that the food was made in a non-Jewish pot, because it's even if they cook the food in your kosher pot. And says Rashi, why? Why are these things prohibited? Says Rashi, chuhu mishum hatnut. This is all due to marriage, meaning intermarriage. These things are prohibited because they may lead to Jews marrying non-Jews. Now let's just finish up this list, and we'll get back to this, because this is our topic today, shelakot. And kivashin are pickled things which you put wine and vinegar into. Tarit trufa. This is where the list starts to get into like a terrain of foods we're not so familiar with. But this is a pickled herring, which sorry, that's number 3. This is a pickled thing. So tarit terefa, number 4, a pickled herrings which had been minced. 5, sir she'en bo daga kalbit shotetet bo, brine in which there's no kalbit fish floating. Chalek. As you see, Faria doesn't seem to really know what that is either. Chalek. 7, a koret shel cheltit, pieces of asophadida. So that one I looked up because I had absolutely no idea what that is. That's some sort of a spice. It's according to a website I looked this out on. It's a hard substance that's extracted from a large carrot-shaped roots roots which were used both for food and medicinal purposes. It's actually like found a lot in the Gemara, Masechet Shabbat, where it talks about foods which are also used for medicinal reasons. And melach, so it's number 8, melach shalkonit. It's kind of a salt. So anyways, these numbers 4 through 8, we're not going to be focusing on. But says the Mishnah, Hari Elu Isurin, Ve'ein Isuran Isur Hana. So all this list of 8 products, these are prohibited to eat, but you are allowed to derive a benefit from them. You're just not allowed to eat them. Okay. So I just want to, I didn't bring for you inside in the sources I gave you, but in the Rambam's Perish La Mishnayot, the Rambam's explanation of the Mishnah, he just gives kind of a nice introduction to this list of prohibited foods listed in this Mishnah, and just gives an overview of why they are prohibited. So the Rambam here writes, I'm reading from the PowerPoint, Rov Elu Hadivarim, most of the things on this list, says the Rambam, Kigon Hapat, like bread, the hashlakot, and the cooked foods, meaning the prohibition of abishal akum, the food cooked by a non-Jew, v'domehem, and those things like them, amnam ne'esru kedei shenitrachek mehem. The reasons these things are prohibited is to make a barrier between Jew and non-Jew. Below nit arev imahem, so we don't come to mingle with them. Kedei shalo nimshach v'hit arvenu imahem, it's pakrut b'masha asur. Because if we, intermingle too much, if you assimilate, then you come to also do some prohibited things as well. So it's not because eating these foods are prohibited in their own right. It's that it may lead you to intermingle too much with non-Jews, and then you will come to marry and do real prohibited things. V'hu inyan omra mishum chatnut, and that's what we mean when we say lest it lead to intermarriage. Now these 8 things which were prohibited in this Mishnah is part of a larger list of 18 things which were decreed against, which are listed actually in Masechet Shabbat, the first parak of Masechet Shabbat. It says that there were 18 things which Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai made prohibited, and these are among those things which were listed there. And Rambam also makes it clear, and when this Mishnah, when we see that it prohibits their cooked food, as Rashi says, it's not due to the fact that there's a concern that they were cooked in the pot of a non-Jew, because obviously that would be prohibited. If you cook food in a pot of a non-Jew, that is just not kosher. That's a treif food, because the taste of the treif food has been absorbed in the pots, which then goes into the food. So that is just usher. That's non-kosher food. But, says the Rambam, Ela nesru mishum davar shenigmru melachto al yedei agoy. These things are just prohibited because it's made by a non-Jew. And again, lefi shachamim asru b'gla halakhah mehem. The rabbis prohibited these foods in order to keep us away from non-Jews and to create like a social barrier. Says the Rambam, kol masha bishlu agoy, anything that a non-Jew cooks. So it's not because, says the Rambam, we think maybe there's some, a pork mixed into it, or because we're concerned that maybe they cooked it in a pot that had meat and milk cooked in it, and that's going to, then be transfused into our food. It's even if they cook the food in a Jew's pot, there's no concern that there's anything non-kosher mixed in. There's a concern that eating together, eating their food, will lead to too much mingling between new and non-Jew, which will ultimately lead to intermarriage in a broader sense, says the Rambam. And this we saw in the Rashi as well. In the second source, on the page, Rashi writes again, Kol davar shebashul bei kochavim afilu bekli tahor kulhu mishum chatnut. Even if the food was prepared in a kosher or a pot, these things are prohibited because of intermarriage. It's a social policy. And, that may think, well, that's weird. How do you go from them making food to, intermarriage? So kind of, I think if you grow up or spend most of your life eating kosher, it's hard to really appreciate the barriers that eating kosher really makes for an observant Jew within larger society. And I really felt that in two ways. One is when I moved to Israel. And suddenly I realized, there's like restaurants in malls. There's a whole food court. Now, living in the US, I never even paid attention to the food court. So it was so not a part of my life and my reality. Then I moved to Israel and it's like, wow, you can eat in the mall, you can in the airport, you can just eat anywhere. And it's not like a barrier between you and just kind of regular society. And another way I felt this was one of my children was diagnosed with celiac. And you really see that when you can't eat with everyone else, it creates kind of a social barrier. You can't just, go to a party or bar bat mitzvah or a wedding, just sit at the table and get the food with everyone else. That's why you have to wait, there can be food there. Can I eat? I can't eat with everyone else because their, breads may fall into my food. So not being able to eat the food of other people does create this kind of automatic social barrier. And it's not that I think if I eat, a fish cooked by a Jew, I'm only, I'm going to intermarry. It just kind of builds a larger culture of separation. And it's just a larger social policy. So that's the view of Rashi and Rambam. However, if we look in the next source, we see that there may be underlying here also a concern of non-kosher food as well. So just stop sharing the screen for a moment. Stop share. Okay. So in the next source you have, we'll now look at the Bavli's discussion of the halakhot of Bishul Akum. And just for those it's not clear, Akum stands for Oved Kochavim, a person who worships stars, meaning it's a term for a non-Jew. So the acronym is Akum. So a Bishul Akum is the food cooked by a non-Jew. So the Bavli's discussion on this line in the Mishnah is the third source you have on the first page, or the second to last source on page 1. So the Mishnah had said v'ha-shelakot. So food cooked by a non-Jew, that's one of the things which are prohibited. So ask the Bavli here, mina hane mili. How do we know this? How does the Mishnah know that, or from where do we know that you're not allowed to eat the food cooked by a non-Jew? How did the Mishnah know that it's prohibited? So answers the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Chia said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kras. So there's a pasuk in the Torah which says, Ochel bekesef tishbereni ve'achalti umayim bekesef titenli v'shatiti. So I will buy water from you and I will drink. So what does this refer to? So this is in Sefer Devarim, Parshat Devarim, where Moshe is recounting how they conquered Sichon and his land. And before they battled with King Sichon, Melech Heshbon, they tried to make a peace with them and say, hey, can we please walk through your land, because we're on our way to Eretz Canaan. We're on our way to the land of Canaan. and we'll walk through your land, Moshe says. We won't, go left or right. We're going to stay on the path. We'll even pay you for your water. So we will pay you so we can drink from your water. Just let us walk through your land. So says the Babli here, says Rabbi Yochanan. Well, what do we see from here? That Moshe was willing to buy water from a non-Israelite. So what do we see from here? Says the Gemara here, Kemayim. It has to be like water. Ma'mayim shalo nishtanu, af ochel shalo nishtaneh. What that shows is that what are you allowed to eat from a non-Jew? Only a food like water. Only something which, like water, wouldn't change. Okay, but then it says, wait a minute. Well, if it's only about changing, you also should not be allowed to have kind of wheat. And then it goes through all these things and, and why this isn't a good way to understand a paradigm of water. So go down to the second to last line. And it goes back and forth, like, what is it about water that makes it allowed? So the last wide line here. So finally, the Gemara says, Ella ka maim. So what is it like water? Why was water allowed? Ma maim shalo nishtanu mibriatam al yadei ha'or. So just like water, if you heat it, it's not going to change what it is. Yeah, maybe it'll boil, but it still remains the same thing that it was before you heated it. It's still water. Maybe it's hot water, it's a boiling water. Maybe we know on a chemical level it does change, but it still remains water even after heating it. So two, you're only allowed to have food which wouldn't alter its form through heat. Okay, so we see from here that you are only allowed to eat that which Moshe was willing to buy from a non-Jew. And what's that? A food whose form is not changed when it is cooked through heat. So then it says, wait a minute, midday or ketiv? Did it mention anything about heat in this pasuk? Where do you get heat from? So answers the Gemara, Ella midorabanan. Really? This whole prohibition against eating food cooked of a non-Jew, meaning food which does get altered by heat, is not really from the Torah. It's a rabbinic prohibition. So what about the pasuk it just brought? Kra asmachta be'alma. The pasuk, the verse it brought from the Devarim, ochal b'kesev tishu birini, that's just an asmachta. And asmachta is when you have a rabbinic halakhah, a rabbinic law, and then you tag it onto a biblical verse as a way to kind of recall it. But it's not really from the Torah. This is not a biblical prohibition. It's really a rabbinic one. And they found a pasuk to tag it onto as a way to remember it. But it's really rabbinic in its origins. So just like food, just like water, which does not change from its natural form, even when it undergoes, heating process, so too, you can have a food that wouldn't change from its natural form, okay? Now, this Gemara says, again, that this is a rabbinic prohibition. Now, on the Mishnah, Rashi and the Rambam both said that the root for this prohibition was a way to prevent intermarriage. Here, however, Rashi's interpretation of this line, he gives a slightly different answer. Here, Rashi explains in the next source, last source on page 1, where it says it's midrabanan, that this is a rabbinic prohibition. Rashi explains, Shalo Yehe Yisrael Ragil Etzlo B'machal u'b'mishtet. The reason for this rabbinic prohibition is so that a Jew will not come to accustom themselves to eat and drink with a non-Jew. And why is that a problem? Not lest you come to intermarry and then violate halakhah on a broader level, but Rashi here says, "Vayachilenu davar tameh." Here, the concern is you might come to eat non-kosher food. So here Rashi is saying it's not because there's a broader concern of intermarriage and kind of mass halachic laxity. Rather, we're concerned you might eat non-kosher food. If you eat food prepared by a non-Jew, you might come to eat other food of a non-Jew, even foods which are not kosher. So we see that Rashi offers us two different reasons for this prohibition. On one hand, Rashi said there's a social policy at play. Not eating the food cooked by a non-Jew is due to a fear that it will lead to intermarriage. But in this Rashi, on the Talmudic discussion of the Mishnah, it's a Kashrut reason. You may come to eat non-kosher food. Now you could read these kind of two together. Why is there a fear of intermarriage? Because you may come to eat non-kosher food. But that seems kind of a stretch to read it that way. And in Adid, Rashi's grandsons and the Tosafot point out this contradiction in Rashi, that he gives two different reasons for the prohibition of a bishul hakum. One, again, a social policy, a fear of lead to intermarriage. And on the other hand, it's a kashrut reason that you may eat non-kosher food. So what do we do with these two different explanations that Rashi gives? So many of the rabbis who lived after Rashi, and in particular were known as Chronim, the rabbis who lived kind of in the modern era after the medieval times, discuss, well, what is the practical difference, or what we call in Talmudic parlance, the nafka, what's the practical difference that comes out of Rashi's two reasons as to whether the reason that bishul hakum is prohibited due to a fear of intermarriage or due to the fact that the food might be unkosher. So a few different reasons have been, or a few different practical differences have been pointed out. So let's look in one, in the next source you have, the top of page 2, a work Tiferet LeMoshe. This is work on the Torah. It follows the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah. So he writes, Ayem Beit Yosef Tamim Alisor Bishulei Goyim. So they're seeing the Beit Yosef. That's Reb Yosef Akairo. He's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and that's his commentary on the Torah. So he lists the two different reasons of Rashi for the prohibition of eating food cooked by a non-Jew. So Yesh Omrim Shema Yachlenu Devarim Asrim. So some say in Rashi that the reason is it's a fear you'll eat non-kosher food. The Yesh Omrim Mishum Hatnut. And some say, again also Rashi, that the fear is it'll lead to intermarriage. Venira li de'afkamina. So now he's going to give, so who cares? What's the difference between these two reasons? Either way, you're not allowed to eat non-kosher food. So what's the difference? So he says, shul shel mumar le'avodah zara asur. The difference is, what about food cooked by a Jew who doesn't keep kosher? A Jew who is mumar to avodah zara. A Jew is a rebellious Jew who doesn't keep halakhah. Are you allowed to eat the food cooked by such a Jew, a non-religious Jew? So Laman damar mishum chatna share. So if the reason is you can't eat food cooked by a non-Jew because it'll lead to intermarriage, then food cooked by a Jew who's not religious should be what? Okay. You're allowed to marry a non-religious a Jew. There's no problem with that. So if the fear is intermarriage, then you of course should be allowed to eat the food prepared by a non-religious Jew, because there's no fear of intermarriage, because there is no intermarriage between different Jews. We're allowed to marry any Jew. But if the reason we don't eat a bishul akum, if the reason we don't eat food cooked by a non-Jew is because you may come to eat non-kosher food, then maybe you're not allowed to eat the food cooked by a non-observant Jew. Aser, it should be prohibited. So that's what the Tiferet LeMoshe points out, that based on these two reasons given by Rashi, it is either okay or not okay to eat the food prepared by a non-observant Jew. By non-religious, I mean non-observant, a Jew who doesn't keep halakhah. So if, again, the reason is intermarriage, then it's okay. But if the reason is you might come to eat non-kosher food, then it would not be okay. Just so you know, Reb Ovadia Yosef, in his halachic tshuvot response to Yabia Omer, he says it is okay because he says, what about a hotel or a restaurant owned by a non-religious Jew? He says, it is okay. You can eat the food. He's like, because these are only rabbinic in their origin, you can rely on the lenient opinions that maybe it's okay. Maybe it would be better to have a religious Jew there, turn on the oven, and we're going to get to all that. But he does rule that it's okay. There is no bishul akum when it comes to Jews who do not observe a kashrut or halakhah. Okay, so that's the first difference that arises between the two different answers of Rashi. That's one. Another difference which arises is it's a much more lam adus, which we'd call like a conceptual answer. A conceptual difference is what if a non-Jew did cook food in your pot? Meaning a non-Jew produced a bishul hakum. Food you're not allowed to cook, and it was made in your pot. What is the status of your pot? Does a bishul akum trafe up your pot the same way that if you were to cook, milk in your meat pot? Does the fact that it's not allowed to eat, does the fact that you're not allowed to eat but a bishul akum make the food treif? Or is it just, the food isn't treif, you're not allowed to eat it, but it's not a treif food. So therefore, your pot will remain kosher, even though you're not allowed to eat that food that a non-Jew cooked in your pot. So of course, there's never one answer to this. Anything. There's a machloket, there's a dispute amongst the Rishonim, the medieval rabbis, on this point. So look in the next source, the third source on page 2. The Torah brings down this dispute about the status of the pot in which a bishul akum was produced. So the Torah writes, the Katav Harashba, so Reb Shlomo ben Deret, the Rashba, he's a medieval rabbi. He writes, "V'chein kelim shebishlu bahem oved gililim." The pots in which a non-Jew cooked food, even if it's your pot, it was a kosher pot. If a non-Jew cooked in your pot, devarim sheyesh mehem mishum v'shulei ovodat gililim, meaning they cook food in which a bishul akum would apply to. Asurim, your pot becomes prohibited. They've trafed up your pot, essentially. Lefichach, therefore, he writes, Sarich lizaher b'shfachot nachriot hamivashlot le'atzmam ba'bayit be'beit Rabban Yisrael. So here we get a little bit of a feel of what life was like. Therefore, he says, when you have your non-Jewish maids in your homes and they cook food, make sure they don't cook it in your pots. If they're making food for them helps. Shalo yanichenu al gabe haor. Make sure they don't leave it on the fire. And if you see they're cooking, if you see your non-Jewish maid cooking on the fire, make sure to take it off the fire or flip it over. And we're going to learn about this before it's fully cooked. So that is a view of the Rash Abba. That a bishul akum would affect the kashrut of your pot. That's the view of the Rashba. So if a non-Jew cooked food in your pot, even though the food was technically kosher food, a bishul akum makes it treif, and now your pot is no longer kosher, and you have to kosher it if it was a metal pot. That's the view of the Rashba. But, says the Torah, lo nihira la'avi harash. But my father, the Rush, that's the famous Rabbeinu Asher, he's the last of the Tosafists, and he's the father of the Torah. He says the Torah, the Rush did not agree with the Rashba. Bechatav, and the Rush writes, she'ein sarich lachosh lazeh kelal. You don't have to worry about this at all. Shelo yichniru bebishulei avodat agililim le'esor pelitato. Yes, we're not allowed to eat bishul akum. We're not allowed to eat the food cooked by a non-Jew. But we then don't prohibit what gets absorbed by it into the pot it was cooked in. You're not allowed to eat it, but it does not affect the status of the pot that it was cooked in. And the Gra, well, I'll get to that in a second. So the Shulchan Aruch brings down both these opinions, and he writes, Kelim shebishel bahem oved kochavim lefanenu devarim shesh behem mishum bishul oved kochavim tzrichem hechsher. So the pot in which, if a bishul akum was done in your pot, any kind of a food with a bishul akum would apply, you have to kosher the pot. So that's the Rashba. V'yesh omrim she'enan tzrichim. But some say, we know that's the Rush, some say that you would not have to kosher the pot. What's the reason for this machloket, this dispute? And again, I'm trying to get to what would be the difference between Rashi's two reasons for the prohibition of bishul akum. So says the Gra, of course, the Vilna Gaon, and he wrote very terse little comments, which were recorded by his students, and he writes here, why does the Rush say you don't have to kosher the pot? The Gra explains, Delo chayesh mijlo shayach hatnut b'chahai agavna. Says the Gra, if the reason is chatnut, if the reason is a fear of intermarriage, so that wouldn't apply to your pots. It's just a concern that would lead to from you eating the food prepared by a non-Jew. But we don't have to extend that concern to your pot once the non-Jew, isn't there anymore, and just whether you're allowed to use the pot or not. So this gets to another difference between Rashi's two reasons for the prohibition of bishul akum. Just want to share my screen. That if the reason is lest they come to give you non-kosher food, then like the Rashba, maybe, we're concerned there's non-kosher food in your pot, and therefore you can't use your pot anymore unless you kosher it. Your pot now became treif. That would be the Rashba, the akashic reason. But if the reason is a social policy, eating their food might lead you to mingle more and ultimately intermarry by eating together, leading to just much more social interaction, then that has nothing to do with your pot, and that would not affect the status of the pot that it was cooked in. So we have the difference between Rashi's two answers for the Teferet LeMoshe. It's can you eat the food of a non-observant Jew? If the reason is if the reason is a fear of intermarriage, then you can eat the food of a non-observant Jew. If the reason is you may come to eat non-kosher food, then that could theoretically apply to a non-observant Jew as well. And in terms of the status of the pot in which a bishul akum was made, again, if the reason is they might come to feed you non-kosher food, then that could affect the pot, and you then could not use this pot anymore unless it underwent a process of koshering. But if the reason is a social policy, so says the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, there's no reason then to prohibit your pot. Your pot remains fine. And that fear of, you might come to marry a Jew would not then make the food treif to then, be absorbed into the walls of your pot, which you then couldn't use it for any other reason. So we see that these two reasons of Rashi, it's not just a intellectual exercise and different reasons for a bishul akum, but it also can have very real, practical halachic ramifications as well. Okay. So that's the first part of this. We've done what is the reason for the prohibition against eating food cooked by a non-Jew. So we're now going to move on to what is the scope of a bishul akum. There are some people who eat at a vegan restaurant, for example, not owned by a Jew, or an Indian restaurant. I remember when I lived in New York, like 20 years ago, that was a big thing to eat in Indian restaurants, something like that, vegan or whatever. So does a bishul akum apply to all foods that are prepared by a non-Jew, all foods that are cooked by a non-Jew? So we'll see in the next text, that's not the case. So in the sources, I will share the screen. I will share so everyone can have access to the text in case you don't have it. So we're up to number 2 on page 2. Which foods does the prohibition of a bishul akum apply to? Because we're going to see now that it does not apply to all foods. There actually is, there's only certain foods it applies to. Okay. So the scope of this prohibition is found on, the prohibition was found in Daf Lamed Azayin to Lamed Chet Amid Aleph. So now this is on the same Daf Lamed Chet Amid Aleph, and again we're still in a tractate Avodah Zarah, because it's all about foods which are prohibited because of Jewish-Gentile relations. Okay, so we're moving on to the next source, which now talks about the scope of this prohibition. Okay. So says the Gemara, Amar, it's hard for me to see 7 minutes. Amar Reb Shmuel bar Yitzchak Amar Rav. So Reb Shmuel bar Yitzchak said the name of Rav, and Rav is the famous first generation of Babylonian Amorah, rabbi of the Babli. Kol hane'achal kemot shehu chai, ein bo mishum bishulei ofdei kochavim. Any food which can be eaten raw, not cooked, bishul akum does not apply. Meaning, even if a non-Jew were to cook it, if it's a food that you could eat non-cooked, you can eat it raw, then a bishul akum would not apply. There's no prohibition from eating it if a non-Jew were to cook the food. Bezhura matnu hachi. This is the tradition that they taught in the Babylonian city of Shura. Bepumpadisa matnu hachi. But in the other Babylonian city of Pumpadisa, they've taught the same tradition in the following manner. Amar B'Shmuel bar Yitzchak Amar Rav, that Shmuel bar Yitzchak said the name of Rav, Kol she'enu nechal al shulchan melachim alepetz bo et hapat, ein bo mishum bishulei kochavim. So now it is any food which would not be served on the table of a king to, what's the word, to eat with their bread, has no prohibition of a bishul akum. Okay. So let me I want to share, to make it clear, a chart of these two different answers. So the prohibition of bishul akum does not apply to either. There's two different traditions of what a bishul akum does not apply to. Either anything that you can eat raw, so that would be basically any vegetable. So even if a non-Jew cooked a vegetable, since you could eat it raw, you can now eat it if a non-Jew cooks it for you as well. So that's one version of what a bishul akum doesn't apply to. The other tradition of what a bishul akum doesn't apply to is anything not fit for a king's table. Anything a king wouldn't eat, anything they wouldn't serve on a king's table has no problem of a bishul akum if a non-Jew cooks it for you. So once again, now the Talmud asks, what's the difference between these two traditions? Asks the Gemara, Mai Be Naihu. What's the difference between these two reasons? You know, who cares? I mean, these two traditions of, sorry, I'm going to share back and forth between two different screens. My Be Naihu. What's the difference if the tradition is you can eat it raw, or it's food that wouldn't go on a king's table? What are the foods that, you know, would be affected based on what the reason is? So answers the Gemara, Ika Beinahu, the difference between these two different traditions are Dagim Kitanim, small fish, Ardi Daisa, and crushed grain or barley. These two, so let me, hold on. Let me go back to my chart so you can see this in more a visual way. Okay, so anything that can be eaten raw, small fish, oh, sorry, it's mushrooms and a pounded wheat or a barley. If so, these foods cannot be eaten raw, so a bishul akum would apply. But apparently these would not be fed in a king's table, so these things would be allowed, meaning if a non-Jew cooked them, it would be okay. And this is explained by Rashi. So in the next source, Rashi explains, Dagim Ketanim, Ardevi Adaisi, so small fish, mushrooms, and pounded wheat or a barley. Rashi explains, Ein Ne'echalim Chayim. These three foods, small fish, mushrooms, and pounded wheat and barley, are not eaten raw. But they wouldn't go on a king's table. So Lelishne Kama, so for the first addition, Yesh Behem Mishum Bishule Avdei Kochavim, a bishul akum, the prohibition would apply because they're not eaten raw. But Lelishne Batra, but because they're not served on a king's table, Sharu, according to this tradition, they would be allowed. So there is a difference between these two traditions about whether the prohibition extends to foods which can be eaten raw, or foods which would not be served on a king's table. Now, the good news is, Tosfos says that you do not need both of these reasons to make food okay. If a non-Jew cooks them, either one would suffice. So the Tosfot, who are again the rabbis who come in the generation after of Rashi, and a few of them are the grandsons of Rashi. So explain here. So so again, a pirish meaning, so these three foods, mushrooms, small fish, mushrooms, and a pounded or crushed barley. She'ena nechalim chayim. Again, like Rashi says, these foods are not eaten raw. But they are not served on a king's table. The Omer Rabbeinu Tam. So Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Meir, he is a grandson of Rashi. He writes Dimidinaketani from the fact that it used these three foods: small fish, mushrooms, and the pounded grain, meaning foods which cannot be eaten raw, but can go on a king's table. The lo nakat vash givina. And why didn't? And so says Rabbeinu Tam, why didn't it bring the foods which can be eaten raw, but go on a king's table? For example, honey and cheese, because these foods so these foods do go on a king's table, and they are eaten raw. Shemamina. So we learn from here. Debai leminaka devarim shenaasim behem lashon acharon musaf arishon ulehakel alav. What this shows was that the Bavli wants to be lenient. It wanted to only bring examples of the latter tradition, meaning things which wouldn't go on a king's table, to show you that you don't need both. You can have either or. It could be either foods which wouldn't go on a king's table. You can have those if a non-Jew cooks them, or you can have food which are eaten raw, and to be lenient. Either one of those two additions would work. You don't need both additions to be met. So even if you have food, as long as it, if it's only food that is not eaten raw, but go on a king's table, that is adequate. So two, you can also be lenient in the other way. If it's food which can be eaten raw, but would go on a king's table. Ulachein pasak Rabbeinu Tam, and therefore Rabbeinu Tam paskins, he said the halakhah is to halchata kehani to terei lishna, that the halakhah is like a both, either or. Ve'i kachad minayu, and if you have one of these, either it's a food which you can eat raw, eino ole, or it's food which would not be served on a king's table, ein bo mishum bishule oved kochavim, then bishul akum would not apply. So you don't need both of these two kind of additions to be met. Either it's a food which you can eat raw, and if a non-Jew cooks it, a bishul akum would not apply, or it's a food which would not be served on a king's table. Even if you were not able to eat it raw, a bishul akum would not apply. And that is how Rabbi Yosef Karo brings down the halakhah. That's how he, in the Shulchan Aruch, established the halakhah as well. He says you need both for a food to be a problem of a bishul akum. And he writes, Tavarsh inu ne'achal k'mo shu chai, v'gam ole al shulchan melachim l'let po et ha'pa'o lepar aperet, shebeshlu ovei kochavim. So if you have any food which you cannot eat raw, and it's a food which would be served on a king's table, and a non-Jew cooked it, and even if it's made in the pot of a Jew or in the house of a Jew, aser mishum bishulei oved kochavim. So you're not allowed to eat it. So it's only prohibited if it's both a food which cannot be eaten raw, and it's a food which cannot go on a king's, which is a food which would go on a king's table. But as long as you could eat it raw, there's no problem of a bishul akum. Or as long as it's a food that would not go on a king's table, it's also not a problem of a bishul akum. Now, how do you define what's a food which would not be eaten raw? And of course, how do you define a food which would not go on a king's table? Now, the second one is a highly subjective qualification, which would definitely depend on the time and a place. And I've heard that the Star K calls the White House to see, at least in the past, to see what is food that would go on, that they would serve at a banquet. So many poskim say it's food that is, would be served at a royal banquet. Now, I was heard the name of the Hazon Ish, that as long as a food is eaten by an important person, it's like Ola al Shulchan Melachim, even if he eats it alone or she eats it alone. But as long as it's not like a low grade kind of food. So I heard the name of Rav Soloveitchik that any kind of canned food is not Ola al Shulchan Melachim, and that might be a reason that some Kashrut organizations allow any vegetable canned food, like the Triangle K, for example, even though no Jew was there in the process at all. So Ola al Shulchan Melachim is definitely kind of a harder qualification to understand. So we have a question in the chat. So if vegetables can be eaten raw, you cooked, and you can have a cooked vegetable by a non-Jew. So the answer would be yes. Now, there's more to it than just that. What about there's oil? So there's more. We're going to get to that. I thought it would be this time. It'll be next time. But let's just now get to, in the few minutes we have left, what does it mean, ne'echal k'mot shehu chai? What's a food that can be eaten raw? So the Ritva, he's also a medieval rabbi, writes, Perush, that means shera'oi lachlo k'mot shehu chai. It means that you could eat it raw, Even if it's a kind of a food that people only eat cooked. So for example, I'm thinking zucchini, maybe. Most people maybe don't eat raw zucchini, although even people do. But let's just say people only ate it cooked. But since you could eat it raw, then Bishul Akum would not apply to that. Now let's look in the Shulchan Aruch, where he lays out some more additions for what that means, a food that's not eaten raw. So he writes, the next source you have, it's right here in the Shulchan Aruch, Dagim ketanim shamachan Yisrael obed kochavim. Small fish that a Jew or non-Jew salts, harehin kimoshinit bashlu. So that is if it's being cooked. V'im salam obed kochavim achar kain mutarim. So if a non-Jew then were to cook it, that would be fine. Because the fact that a Jew salted it, that was as if it was already partially cooked. Aval dagim meluchim gedolim, but large fish, even if they're salted, einan nachlim ela al yedei hadchak. Those are only eaten raw in a pressing kind of a situation. That is not considered a food eaten raw. So it has to be something that people do and would eat raw, but not in like an extreme setting. So I'm thinking of a potato. I once heard a friend of mine that during the Holocaust, they ate raw potatoes. So that's not something that otherwise people never eat raw. So that would not mean that it's a food eaten raw, because in the most extreme situation, people ate it raw. It has to be something that people could eat raw in, not techak kind of heading. However, says Ramah, but yesh, says the Shulchan Aruch, yesh matirin. However, some people do allow it. But then the Ramah writes here, the Ramah is Reb Moshe Isserlis. He's from Poland. He's the Ashkenazi. A gloss is on the Shulchan Aruch. Chen kol devar shenachal chai al yedei hadechak ubishlu oved kochavim dino kedagim gedolim. Any food which you only eat raw because you're really pressed to, that is like large fish, and bishul akum would apply to it. And then he also writes, Peitza, an egg, even though a pregnant woman apparently would eat a raw egg, sounds crazy. So even though a pregnant woman might eat a raw egg, apparently at some point people thought that was a good thing to do, that's also not considered a food eaten raw just because someone does it for medicinal kinds of a reason. And again, the Shulchan Aruch then brings another food which is only eaten raw in kind of emergency kind of settings. Timarim, hamarim, kitzah, bitter dates. Again, they're only eaten raw because people are really oppressed to. Again, those are prohibited as well. So it has to be a food that even if people don't generally eat raw, people could and would eat it raw, but not just because they're like, desperate and there's nothing else to eat. It has to be something which people would legitimately eat raw and not in an extreme kind of situation. And the Taz, the Turei Zahav, a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch also says about eggs, hata'am, meaning the achila ayedei hadechaki. People, even a pregnant woman apparently only ate eggs, raw eggs, because they really had to. They were oppressed to. Then he says, "Va'af liyesh matirim." Now, what about? Remember, we said in this first Shulchan Aruch that there were some people who allowed eating large salted fish cooked by a non-Jew. He says that only applied to that specific case of the fish. Even those who allowed a Jew to eat a large fish cooked by a non-Jew, modim kan ubitmarim hamarim. They would agree that you cannot eat an egg cooked by a non-Jew or the bitter dates here. Why? Shekan ein ne'achalim ella al yedei dochak gadol. Because these two, you really only eat if you're truly desperate. Like that's really an extreme reason you would eat it. So these things, which you really only eat in the most kind of a dire, desperate situation, bishul akum would apply to it. But if it's just kind of minorly, you're eating because, you're really hungry, but it's not like desperate, then there are those who are lenient about that as well. Okay, so to sum up what we've done, let me just go back to my PowerPoint, a little over time, but we started a minute late, so I think it's okay. We saw that the food prepared by a non-Jew are one of the 8 things which the rabbis prohibited. While we saw in the Talmud that was originally tried to be learned out from a biblical verse, the Talmud then kind of clues that it was really a rabbinic prohibition. And the 2 reasons for the prohibition given by Rashi are, one, either it's a social policy, it's a fear will lead to intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. So having a food barrier is a great way to keep people apart. Or the other explanation given by Rashi, that it's a kashrut reason. There is a fear that they will give you non-kosher food, either in the food that they cook for you, or if you eat their food and you're eating together, you might ultimately come to eat the other food of a non-Jew as well, even the non-kosher food. And then we saw that there's a difference. There are differences between these 2 reasons Rashi gives. First is, well, can you eat the food of a non-observant Jew? If the reason for a bishul akum is a fear it'll lead to marrying non-Jews, and that would not apply to food cooked by a non-observant Jew. We're allowed to marry each other. But if the reason is the fear that you'll come to eat non-kosher food, then that could apply if a non-observant Jew is the one preparing the food. Another difference between Rashi's 2 answers is, what's the status of the pot in which bishul akum was cooked? If the reason is that they may come to give you non-kosher food, or they may come to add non-kosher food, that could trafe up your pot, and you'd have to kasher it, and that's what the Rosh Haba says. But if the reason is, again, it's a fear to lead you to marry a non-Jew, well, that would not affect your pot, and you would not have to kasher your pot. And says the Gra, that is the source for the Russia's leniency, who says that a bishul akum would not affect the kashrut status of your pot in which a non-Jew cooked even kosher food. Then we examined the scope of the prohibition of a bishul akum. Either it does not apply to any food which can be eaten raw, and we saw that that means, even if people don't generally eat it raw, since you could eat it raw and not in the most like a dire extreme situation, then if a non-Jew cooks the food, you are allowed to eat it. So a vegan restaurant, you can eat the vegetables cooked by a non-Jew. Or if it's anything that would not be served at a king's table. Now, what that applies to, it's very hard to say. Canned food, some say, maybe potato chips. Now, even though you can eat it raw, but it wouldn't go on a king's table. But does it matter that maybe it would be served in the king's table, not in the chip form, but in another form? So does it go by what it is right now or in its original product? So that's much larger discussion, but maybe like a breakfast cereal. That's a kind of food I think we can all say would not go at the banquet of a king. So in a Kellogg's, you don't need to have a Jew there turning on the ovens when, however it is they make any of the foods they make, because no one would serve corn flakes at a banquet or any of the breakfast foods that are made. So those are the kind of things that bishul akum would not apply to. Now, we don't necessarily feel the applications of many of these halakhot right now that we just learned, but these are what guide a kashrut, the larger kashrut organizations, in what foods are given a halakhah for and not. And when a place will get a halakhah, it's not always that there's a Jew there. It could be because we are following these principles here that we learn right now. So next time we'll get to more. Let's get to, well, what about eating a vegetable that's mixed with other foods that a non-Jew cooks. And let's say it's a food that you could eat raw mixed with a food that you are not allowed, that you aren't able to eat raw. What do we go by? And does that affect the food that you could eat raw? So we're going to get to that, and we'll get to the whole having a Jew turn on the oven thing, all that next time. So thank you all so much. Any questions?
Not seeing any questions in the chat, but I'm sure we can cover any that comes up next week. Thank you to Dr. Strauch for a great start to the class. I am looking forward to next week for our next session. Thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We are going to continue our fall programming tonight at 8 p.m. with the first part of a 3-part series by Rabbanit Leah Sarna called Kavod Hamet and Kavod Habriot, the honor of the dead. Tomorrow at 1 p.m., Dr. Hanan Gafni will begin teaching his multi-part class on the origins of academic Jewish studies. And then tomorrow at 8 p.m., Rabbi David Silber will begin his multi-part class on imagining King David in the Babylonian Talmud. If you have not yet registered, you can find the Zoom links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes or watch live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again to Dr. Strauch Schick for the opportunity to learn with you and for everyone who attended, and I look forward to next week. Bye, everyone.